From Washington, D.C., this is Middle East Focus.
Welcome to Middle East Focus. I'm Alistair Taylor, MEI's editorial director, and today we're going to be talking about Algeria. Since it began last February, a huge national protest movement, known in Arabic as Hirak, has brought millions of Algerians to the streets over the past year. They've pushed for sweeping reforms of the political system and a change in the ruling elite, leading to the resignation of longtime President Abdelaziz Bouteflika in April 2019. To discuss how the protest movement has evolved, where things stand now at the one-year mark, and possible scenarios going forward, I'm joined today by three great guests: Amel Boubekeur, Robert Ford, and Dalia Ghanem. Amel is a visiting fellow in the Middle East and North Africa program at European Council on Foreign Relations. Her research focuses on Maghreb politics and Islam in Europe. Robert is a senior fellow at MEI and Yale's Jackson Institute for Global Affairs. He was previously a career member of the U.S. Foreign Service, during which time he served as the ambassador to Algeria, deputy ambassador to Iraq, and ambassador to Syria, among other positions. Dalia is a research scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut and the co-director for gender-related work for the program on civil-military relations in Arab states, where her work examines political and extremist violence, radicalization, Islamism, and jihadism with an emphasis on Algeria. Today's program will be divided into two parts. I'll be speaking with Robert and Amel first, followed by Dalia afterwards. Robert, Amel, welcome to the program. Thank you both for joining us today.
Nice to be with you.
Thank you.
Robert, let's start with you and a bit of background for our listeners. What initially sparked the protests in early 2019?
The protests initially started just in one city and then spread very quickly, but almost immediately it took a demand for a complete change of the system, basically a reaction to President Bouteflika's plan to run for an unprecedented fifth term.
And how has the protest movement evolved over the past year?
In some ways, its demands have not changed very much. It still wants a break with the old governing system, and it wants a complete break, really a cleaning of the house. It is a little more anti-military than it used to be. It has added to its slogans the desire to have a civilian state, not one run by the military. But essentially, its demands haven't changed very much.
Amel, how widespread has involvement in the protests been among Algerians? And can you give us a sense of what the mood and atmosphere has been like on the streets?
Yes, I think above all, it's a long-term movement. It's not a sudden revolution or a revolt that was restricted to the fall of Bouteflika, as it has been said before. I think there have been three main phases to the movement. The first one was, of course, this very euphoric rediscovering of civil liberties and freedom to demonstrate and to take the streets. That was a very important moment for Algerians. But still, since Gaid Saleh, the then army's chief in staff, decided to quickly wrap up the transition and to organize elections, the Hirak has been focusing much more, as it has been said before, on a clear demand for a civilian state instead of a military one. And somehow the majority of Algerians, some Algerians who were part of the Hirak first, may have been afraid by this prospect of a demilitarization of the Algerian regime. And so, of course, less people were present in the demonstrations. And after the elections, the presidential elections in December that have seen Tebboune as a new president, I would say that the Hirak has definitely entered in a third new phase that is about the absolute consensus and necessity to build a structural and institutional alternative to Tebboune's presidency as a transition shaped by the regime. And among the Hirak, there's a consensus now. There's a need for a rupture with the state and with the regime, and a need to invent new modes of organization, not to cancel the demonstrations. They should go on according to people in the Hirak, but to complement them with new forms of action.
Robert, a year is a really long time to sustain this kind of regular, large-scale protest movement. I'm just curious, how has the Hirak been able to kind of maintain that level of mobilization over that period of time?
Well, first, their demands haven't been met. And so, in a sense, people are frustrated and they insist upon change. Second, there hasn't been violence. And when you watch some of the demonstrations, I don't know what Amel would think, but they seem to have, in some cases, a sort of a very good sense of camaraderie. And I wouldn't call it a festival, but certainly a sense of community, which actually is somewhat new to Algeria in these kinds of big demonstrations. No violence, which is quite remarkable. And I have to say, because the government really is clearly not changing very much, they're still using a lot of their old methods of government with harassment and arrests and such things. It's actually ended up inciting people in some cases. So now they routinely, for example, carry posters demanding the liberation of journalists who have been held or political activists who are being held. The government is treating it with kind of carefully, but is making no serious concessions. And so people are still angry.
Amel, one point that Robert just touched on is kind of looking back at Algeria's history. It seems like the regime has a fairly standard playbook that it used when responding to protests, and they're kind of doing the same thing again here. How has that played out this time around?
Yeah, definitely. The regime, since the official end of the civil war in 1999, that coincided with the appointment of Bouteflika as a new civilian president, has always had a set of tools to calm down protests and demands for change. The most important being the internalization of these demands for change, in order to give that the regime and specifically the army is the one in charge of leading a transition, that somehow no transition can be led by civilians because the army is really the main actor, the most powerful, de facto the most powerful actor, and then should be solely in charge of the transition. These times, and so they have organized these transitions through sham elections, charades of consultations with in-house civilian society members. But that time, we can remark that fixed elections cannot be used anymore as a substitute for the lack of negotiation with the citizens. Of course, Tebboune lacks legitimacy among Algerians, but furthermore, Tebboune is not even able, as non-traditional members of the military clique in Algeria, to rebalance or to make or to offer a new balance of power between the military, the secret services, and the figure of the civilian president. There's also political parties, in-house political parties or co-opted opposition parties that the regime is used to instrumentalize in order to give the feeling that a new era is going on and that the army is in favor of and in charge of a new transition. But these political parties actually, and specifically the political parties that have been loyal to the regime and which once used to act as go-betweens with the regime's local clientelist networks to encourage people to engage in elections and so on. Well, these parties are currently in no position to inject new enthusiasms, if I can put it that way, into the national politics. For the simple reason that their former leaders, for example, the former leader of the FLN or the RND, which are the two main parties close to the regime, are in prison. So there have been a very important turnover of politicians and leaders that have been connected to the regime. And we can see a real alternative, new way to do things or new faces in order to materialize this narrative on a new era, on a new political era.
Robert, this is something we've touched on a few times here in this conversation so far, but I'm curious to get your thoughts. Has there been a fundamental change in how the military is perceived in Algeria as a result of the protest movement?
I think the military has reverted back to its standard operating procedures, which is to stay in the background. to set limits on how far civilians can operate, back to business, as it were. There was a period during 2019 when the then army chief, Gaid Salah, was exceptionally public and basically gave national speeches every Tuesday explaining or dictating what the national policy would be in terms of politics. It was remarkable. I don't recall ever seeing an Algerian army chief so public on politics. That is not happening now, but the army is very much still in the background.
Amel, do you have a sense of whether there have been splits within the regime on how to deal with the protest movement as time has gone on, especially following the death of Army Chief of Staff Gaid Salah in December?
I think Salah has left behind him a clear roadmap that is about coordinating more closely than under Bouteflika between the army, the police, and the secret services. I think this is crucial for the survival of the regime and and countering the threat of the Hirak, the perceived threat of the Hirak. But I don't believe that this will be enough actually to meet the challenge created by Bouteflika's legacy, because Bouteflika's governance was highly divisive. So if you remember, in 2004, Gaid Salah was appointed as the army chief in staff by Bouteflika himself. So there, despite the willingness to show a new unified regime and governing elite clique, if I can put that way, it won't be enough actually to persuade the Algerians that this is a functioning configuration. First, as I mentioned, it's Tebboun's lack of influence over this new balance of power between the military and the secret services is noticeable, and I don't see how Tebboun will be able to put forward any substantive policy that could create a consensus between the military and the civilian parties of the regime. So I believe that maybe the choice of Tebboun as a president may be only a temporary one, a way to earn time and to consider how the army may or may not open any kind of negotiation with the Hirak.
Robert, I'm curious to get your view on how you see things developing going forward. Is there any possibility that Tebboun could be seen as a sort of transitional leader in your view?
I think he'll be there for as far as the eye can see. Right now, he has several projects which he's announced that his administration will adopt. And it's very much an effort to say that the country has returned to normalcy and that the administration is functioning in its foreign policy initiatives with Libya, and on the domestic front, preparing changes to the Constitution and preparing for legislative elections. Not sure there'll be much turnout. And sort of the system will go forward. And it's important for listeners to remember that I think a very great many Algerians for decades have not had much enthusiasm for this system, and that was okay for the system. They didn't care. And so I think they're just going to sort of revert to their standard operating procedure and move forward with or without much legitimacy.
We're running short on time here, but how do you see things developing going forward? And is there anything you'll be watching particularly closely over the next few months?
Yeah, I think it will be important to look closely at how the Hirak may favor the emergence of not solely a new leadership. It's not a matter of person, but new structures of representativeness and propositions towards the Algerian as a whole, even those who have not joined the Hirak. I think this is something that will have a major impact on the prospect of any kind of negotiations with the regime. And of course, we'll have also to pay close attention to the way the military and the secret services will give some freedom to the Hirak to do so, or just use security repression as a solely and as their unique political answer.
Well, we'll leave things there for today. But Robert, Amel, thank you both for joining the program.
Thank you.
My pleasure. Thank you.
In the next segment of the program, we'll be speaking with Dalia Ghanem to get her perspective on the protest movement. Dalia, welcome to the program, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Where does the Algerian protest movement stand 1 year on? How much, in your view, has it achieved over the past year?
Well, I think, we shouldn't be that harsh towards the movement because, of course, even if it didn't achieve the main objective, which is يتنحوا, which means they will all be removed, I think it achieved pretty good tangible results. Of course, the first one would be the removal and the departure of President Abdelaziz Bouteflika, the trials actually of business tycoons and of the brother of President Bouteflika. But I think the best result until now is that this popular movement have broken the wall of fear, and Algerians are capable today to say out loud what they want, to verbalize it, to take up to the streets, to demonstrate peacefully, pacifically, and they've been doing that for years. So I think they showed the world, but also the region, the MENA region that has been shaken by violent protests, that they were capable to do it peacefully and civically, and to achieve some tangible yet, of course, modest results.
What does victory look like at this point for the protesters?
I think a victory would look like for the protesters to agree on a roadmap, to agree on tangible and achievable objectives, and this is what is lacking right now. It is true that the movement is now showing any signs of abating, but it is also true that the movement shown small signs of dissensions, and until now we are not sure whether the popular movement agreed on one or two, very defined and realistic objectives. So I think the urgency after 1 year now is to institutionalize itself. There is a modicum of institutionalization that has to be done, because while it is true that the leaderless movement has its strong point, it has also its weak points, and no movement can go on and on and on like that endlessly. So there is a modicum of institutionalization to think about, and then there is this roadmap with tangible and specifically realistic results to achieve. Of course, while the slogan "يتنحوا" is very attractive and has been a motto, it is not realistically doable.
You just touched on it now, but one of the issues, of course, has been the question of leadership of the protest movement. Do you get a sense that there are any signs that there are or leaders or potential interlocutors that could serve as negotiators with the government?
Well, the problem is not the lack of personalities. The problem, because there is so many of them, and of course the first that would pop up in one's head is Karim Tabu, for instance. But the problem is that the movement doesn't agree on any figures or any leadership potential solution. Why? Because they know that having a leaderless movement is pretty positive, in the sense that the regime cannot co-opt, marginalize, or even put in prison the leadership. And I think Algerians have in memory, what happened in 2001 with the movement of the Berber hinterland, the Arouche. In 2001, there was a popular movement in the region of Kabylia, and they institutionalized, and there was a leadership, but unfortunately that leadership has been co-opted and eventually marginalized. So Algerians don't want this same, and to their movement, and this is why they have been rejecting any solution of or any institutionalization. But again, they need to agree on that. Otherwise, time is going to get to them, and also exhaustion. Let us remember here that it's been a while, and people start to get tired. I mean, it is very tiresome, to do it every Friday. It has a toll on people psychologically, even if for now the movement didn't show any signs of receding.
The new president, Abdelmadjid Tebboune, has said he will respond to some of the protest movement's demands, including the kind of main political demand of constitutional reform. Do you think he's likely to be able to make the sort of systemic reforms necessary to address protesters' concerns?
Well, Tebboune, as you said, it has announced actually many things. He has announced the moralization of public affairs and political life. He also, as you said, it promised the revision of the constitution. He has promised a constitution that, would strengthen rights and freedom, fights corruption, consolidate the separation of power, and reinforces parliament. But all presidents did that before him. And today, Tebboune is in a very, sensitive position, in the sense that he is in search of legitimacy because he lacks total legitimacy. He is seen in the eyes of a majority of Algerians as the president who has been brought once again by the military. And he is put also in a sensitive position in the sense that, of course, it is the military who brought Tebboune in power. So his leeway or his, capability to move is very, is very limited. There is the military behind the scene. Let us here be realistic and be very straight about what's going on. The military insisted on organizing presidential elections in Algeria because they didn't want to stay in the limelight and they wanted to get back behind the scene. But it's clear for Algerians, the military institution got back behind the scene. They are not governing, but they are still ruling the country. And of course, Tebboune is not totally, he cannot do whatever he wants. And I don't imagine Tebboune also, biting, if I may say, the hand that fed him and the hand that brought him to power.
Does he have greater room to maneuver on the economic front? I know he's also vowed to kind of turn around the economy and deal with some of the longer term issues there. Do you think he has more scope for action there?
I'm not sure about that. And let us also keep in mind, again, that whatever kind of reforms that Algeria will follow, the military needs to have their say on that. In the 80s, this is what happened when in the late 80s, they decided for al-infitah, which means the opening. So, of course, there are big interests for the military, for the political leadership, and so on and so forth. And nothing can be done without the approval of the military and some ruling generals. But again, the economic situation is very worrisome in the country. We are reaching, today our exchange, reserve exchange have melted dramatically, and we have something like 11 months of imports left. If the government wants to sustain its spending, it needs a barrel at $116, and this is not going to happen. So there is a looming crisis in Algeria, and the question is what will happen in 11 months when the economic crisis will hit severely the Algerian citizen.
We're running a bit short on time, but where do you see things going from here?
Well, it's difficult to predict, but I think the popular movement is going on because Algerians are very, eager to show their strength. But this is a war of attrition. But unfortunately, who is going to win? We are not sure about the winner. But in any case, I think Algerians have achieved in 1 year what they haven't done in the last decades. So in anything, this is the status quo has been broken, and this is already, a victory by itself.
We'll have to leave things there, but Dalia, thank you so much for joining the program today.
You are most welcome. My pleasure.
And thank you as well to our audience for listening in and to our production team for their work on today's program. We will see all of you next week.
This has been a presentation of the Middle East Institute. To support MEI's programs and podcasts, please donate at www.mei.edu. Thank you for your support.